Winter presses itself against St. Petersburg like a held breath, snow settling into corners of stone courtyards, boot prints erased almost as soon as they are made, and somewhere inside a narrow workshop lit by a single wavering lamp, a woman threads a needle with hands already familiar with waiting. She works where uniforms pass through quietly, coats heavy with authority, buttons stamped with imperial insignia, and although she rarely looks up, she knows the weight of rank by sound alone, the sharper step of officers distinct from the softer shuffle of clerks. This is Tsarist Russia, late imperial, where hierarchy is not just enforced but rehearsed daily, a mainstream historical reality in which class determines speech, posture, and even the direction one is permitted to look while standing still. She is a seamstress, unnamed by record, known only by skill, precision, and reliability, which is often how women of her class survive history, through usefulness rather than acknowledgement, a fact historians still argue reflects practicality more than injustice, though the distinction feels thin. On this particular afternoon, an officer pauses longer than required, coat draped over his arm, posture rigid with habit, and she notices the hesitation the way one notices a change in temperature rather than a sound. He does not speak at first, which is already unusual, and when he does, his voice carries restraint trained into muscle, suggesting command even in courtesy, a tone learned in academies designed to strip excess emotion from young men efficiently. There is a quirky superstition among Russian tailors that the first stitch sets the fate of the garment, and she begins carefully, unaware that this coat will return again and again until it becomes less fabric and more pretext. He watches her work with an attention that borders on curiosity, not desire, not yet, but recognition, as if something in her quiet competence unsettles him more than admiration ever could. You might think this is where romance announces itself clearly, but history rarely works that way, and neither does longing, which prefers gradual accumulation over dramatic arrival. Snow thickens outside, muting the city, and for a moment the Empire feels distant, reduced to fabric, breath, and shared silence, which is dangerous, because intimacy often enters disguised as calm. She hands the coat back, fingers brushing wool, nothing improper, yet the contact lingers in memory longer than it has any right to. A small theft of attention that neither names. He thanks her formally, too formally, a slight overcorrection, and leaves without looking back, which is exactly how discipline manifests when it notices something it does not intend to keep. As the door closes, she exhales, surprised to discover she had been holding her breath. And yes, this is the part you probably won't survive easily, because it feels too small to matter, and yet already does. She returns to her work, but the rhythm is altered, the needle fractionally slower, because something has shifted, not outwardly, not visibly, but inwardly, where empires have no jurisdiction. Outside, church bells mark the hour with bureaucratic certainty, and neither of them yet understands that this meeting, so brief it barely qualifies as an event, has quietly begun a waiting that will outlast uniforms, seasons, and eventually the empire itself. He passes again 2 weeks later, snow clinging to the hem of his greatcoat, and this time she recognizes his step before she sees him, a mainstream historical truth of working-class spaces where sound often precedes sight, and where familiarity forms long before permission ever arrives. The officer brings no urgency, no damage that requires immediate attention, only a minor adjustment requested with careful politeness, which historians still argue was genuine courtesy, or a learned performance meant to maintain distance without cruelty? She nods, sets the coat across her table, and notices how meticulously it has been cared for, as if he treats his uniform not merely as clothing but as a second skin, stitched with expectation and consequence. There is a quirky belief among seamstresses that garments absorb the character of their wearers, and as she works, she imagines his days shaped by corridors, commands, and restraint, a life louder than hers, yet somehow lonelier. He remains this time, standing near the window, pretending to read a notice while watching her reflection in the glass, an act subtle enough to remain deniable, which is often how people test desire when they are afraid of what acknowledgement would require. Their conversation stays practical, yet pauses grow longer, questions slightly unnecessary, and she answers with care, because in Zara's society, women of her class learn early that attention from above can be opportunity or danger, sometimes both at once. Historians still argue whether cross-class familiarity was discouraged by law or by fear, but in practice the boundary policed itself efficiently through tone, posture, and the unspoken understanding of who waits and who is waited for. He asks how long the repair will take, though he could simply return later, and she gives an honest estimate, sensing this question is not really about time but about permission to return without explanation. Outside, a sleigh passes, bells chiming brightly, and for a moment the sound cuts through the room like misplaced joy, an emotional aside that almost makes her laugh at the absurdity of finding warmth in such a cold arrangement. He nods, thanks her again, and this time allows himself a brief glance, direct and unguarded, which she meets only halfway, lowering her eyes not from shame, but from survival instinct sharpened by experience. When he leaves, she feels the absence immediately, an irrational response to someone she barely knows, and yet historians still argue whether familiarity is born from duration or from attention, a debate that feels settled in her chest. Days pass. Then he returns exactly when she said he would, neither early nor late, which pleases her more than she expects, because reliability is a form of kindness rarely afforded to those expected to wait. Their exchanges remain restrained, but repetition accumulates meaning, and she begins to measure weeks by the interval between his visits, a habit she recognizes as dangerous and continues anyway. He tells himself this is coincidence, convenience, routine, words that allow him to avoid examining why he chooses this workshop over others closer to his barracks. And so a pattern forms, quiet, unremarkable, and already resistant to interruption, because longing that grows inside routine rarely announces itself until it has become difficult to remove. By early spring the city loosens slightly, snow retreating into gutters, and with it comes a subtle permission for people to linger, which is how their interactions lengthen, not through declaration but through the quiet extension of moments neither has the authority to name. He begins bringing small repairs that do not strictly require professional attention, a loose seam, a button barely strained, a mainstream historical habit among officers who used errands to structure their days, though historians still argue whether such choices were conscious or simply emotionally economical. She notices, of course, because waiting sharpens perception, and she adjusts her schedule accordingly, finishing other work early on days she suspects he might come, an act that feels both foolish and necessary, like preparing for weather that may or may not arrive. There is a quirky superstition among Russian seamstresses that unfinished hems invite bad fortune, and she becomes meticulous to the point of obsession, as if perfect stitches might compensate for the disorder she senses forming quietly inside her thoughts. Their conversations expand carefully, never straying into personal confession, yet edging closer to recognition, shared observations about weather, about the city's pace, about how time seems to move differently depending on who is required to wait for whom. He listens more than he speaks, which surprises her, because officers are trained to command, not to receive, and this reversal feels intimate without being improper, a small inversion of hierarchy that lingers in the air longer than either expects. Historians still argue whether emotional intimacy without physical expression constituted transgression in Tsarist moral codes, but here, intimacy is measured not by touch, but by attention sustained beyond necessity. She learns his habits without asking, the way he removes his gloves, the pause before he speaks, and he learns hers, the slight tilt of her head when concentrating, the way she exhales through her nose when a stitch goes wrong, details that feel dangerously specific. Once, he smiles at something she says, an unguarded expression that startles them both, and she nearly laughs, catching herself just in time, because laughter here would demand explanation neither can afford to provide. Outside, factory whistles cut through the air, reminding her of the larger world pressing forward, and she wonders briefly how many lives are unfolding simultaneously, unseen, bound by duty and delay in different configurations of the same quiet ache. He brings her tea one afternoon, an unnecessary kindness, and immediately apologizes, as though generosity itself has violated protocol, which almost makes her smile again, because remorse delivered too quickly often reveals desire more honestly than confidence. She accepts the cup without comment, fingers brushing porcelain, and the silence that follows feels companionable rather than awkward, a shift she recognizes with both comfort and alarm, because ease is rarely neutral in unequal relationships. A fringe note from police archives of the era mentions concern over fraternization blurring class lines, and although no one watches them now, the awareness of possible scrutiny settles into her posture like a shadow. She's learned to stand inside. He begins to look forward to these visits with an attention that surprises him, rehearsing restraint on the walk over, only to feel it loosen slightly each time she meets his eyes, with calm familiarity rather than expectation. By the time the river ice breaks, their connection has solidified into something neither names yet both protect instinctively, a shared silence that feels less like absence and more like an agreement written without ink, binding precisely because it is never spoken. By late spring, the waiting begins to change its texture, no longer patient or abstract, but sharpened by awareness. Because once hope learns a name, even an unspoken one, it stops pretending to be neutral and starts demanding small, unreasonable loyalties. He arrives one afternoon unsettled, posture tighter, voice clipped, and she senses it immediately. The way people attuned to silence recognize disturbance before it explains itself. A skill learned by those whose lives depend on reading what is not said. Mainstream histories of Tsarist military life remind us that officers were bound by strict codes of conduct, especially regarding class boundaries. Yet historians still argue whether enforcement relied more on regulation or on internalized fear of disgrace. He mentions a transfer casually, as though speaking of weather, and the word lands heavily between them, altering the room's proportions, because uncertainty, once introduced, expands faster than truth ever manages to. She nods, offers a neutral response and continues stitching, an automatic grace refined by necessity, while inside her thoughts scatter, because waiting without an object is endurance, but waiting with an ending attached is something closer to grief. There is a quirky belief among working women that thread knots formed unintentionally signal impending separation, and when her needle snags, she stills her hands deliberately, refusing superstition even as her chest tightens with recognition. He does not look at her while speaking now, as though eye contact might obligate him to something he cannot deliver, a choice that feels both protective and cowardly, depending on how closely one examines it. She asks nothing, not because she lacks questions, but because questions imply entitlement, and entitlement is a luxury she has never been encouraged to practice in a world where survival favours emotional economy. Historians still argue whether silence in unequal relationships represents agency or resignation, and standing here, the distinction blurs, because her quiet is both self-preservation and a form of dignity she refuses to surrender. He explains the transfer is temporary, maybe permanent, his uncertainty carefully framed as professionalism, though uncertainty, when rehearsed aloud, often seeks reassurance rather than clarity. She offers none, only nods again, because reassurance would expose investment, and exposure would demand response, something the structure of their lives has already decided against. Outside, carriage wheels pass, ordinary and loud, and the world continues with irritating indifference, reminding them that private meaning rarely disrupts public schedules. He thanks her, unnecessarily, for her work, for her time, for something unnamed, and the accumulation of gratitude feels dangerously close to farewell. She finishes the repair flawlessly, hands steady despite the quiet storm inside her, because skill, when perfected, becomes a refuge where emotion can hide without being erased. As he leaves, she watches the door longer than usual, aware that waiting has shifted again. No longer oriented toward arrival, but toward the slow, unfamiliar task of preparing for absence. Summer arrives with pale nights and reluctant darkness, and the city pretends nothing has shifted, though she feels it immediately because waiting, once redirected toward loss, becomes heavier, more deliberate, a mainstream historical experience for working women whose lives were shaped less by choice than by the schedules of men who could leave. The officer's visits slow, then stop, not abruptly but politely, which is how Zara systems avoided drama, and historians still argue whether such gradual withdrawal was meant to soften endings or simply protect the departing from witnessing consequence. She continues working, uniforms coming and going, each coat a reminder of his absence. And there is a quirky belief among seamstresses that repeating the same stitch too often dulls the needle, which she feels now, not in metal but in her own attention. Rumours drift through the workshop. Transferred officers, new postings, whispered names, and although none confirm anything, they create a climate of anticipation that feels cruelly impersonal because her story exists only in fragments, carried by others who do not know its weight. Historians still argue whether waiting constituted agency or passive endurance for women of her class, yet, in practice, waiting is active work requiring discipline, imagination and restraint, especially when society praises patience without acknowledging its cost. She imagines him elsewhere, in another city, another room, speaking carefully to new faces, and yes, this is one of these moments where the mind behaves like an unhelpful novelist, filling gaps with scenes that only sharpen the ache rather than resolve it. A fringe note in police records of the era mentions concern over emotional entanglements disrupting discipline, and she wonders, briefly, whether their silence has already succeeded in preserving order, at the expense of something far less visible and far more personal. Clients comment on her focus, her calm, mistaking endurance for peace, which almost makes her laugh, because survival often looks like serenity from the outside, an emotional aside that feels too accurate to be comforting. Weeks pass without word, and absence hardens into pattern, forcing her to accept that waiting now lacks even the possibility of interruption, a realization that settles slowly like dust, coating everything evenly until it becomes part of the room. By summer's end, she understands that what remains is not hope, but memory disciplined into habit, and that discipline, once learned, will carry her forward whether she wants it to or not, because the world, unlike longing, does not pause to ask permission. Autumn returns with sharp clarity, the kind that makes sound travel farther, and she feels time differently now, not as a sequence of days, but as a measured endurance, a mainstream historical rhythm for women whose lives advance through repetition rather than transition. While historians still argue whether such continuity was stability or erasure, she learns, indirectly, that he's been stationed far south, a name mentioned in passing by a client, and the information lands with surprising calm because certainty, even painful certainty, is less exhausting than ambiguity stretched thin across months of silence. There's a quirky belief among working women that knowing the destination of a lost thing prevents it from haunting you, and she clings briefly to this thought, as if geography might succeed where discipline failed. He writes once, briefly, formally, a letter shaped like closure without saying so, explaining duty, necessity, and restraint, the familiar vocabulary of men trained to justify distance with honour, a language historians still debate as sincere or structurally convenient. She reads the letter once, then again, then folds it carefully, because careful folding is how one preserves something without inviting others to notice its value, a small domestic ritual that feels oddly ceremonial. She does not reply immediately, not from cruelty, but because response would reopen a rhythm she's already begun to survive without, and survival, once established, resists interruption even from affection. A fringe note in contemporary diaries mentions that unanswered letters often carried more emotional weight than correspondence itself, and she understands this intuitively, choosing silence not as punishment, but as attainment. He waits for a reply longer than he admits to himself, measuring days against imagined explanations, until waiting begins to resemble the discipline he once relied on, revealing how easily restraint turns inward when left without direction. Historians still argue whether his letter represents confession or absolution, though from her position, it reads as something quieter and more troubling, a request to be remembered without requiring responsibility for what memory costs. When winter threatens again, she stores the letter with fabric remnants, because in her world the personal survives best when disguised as practical, and this decision, small and precise, marks the moment longing finally yields to endurance without entirely disappearing. Years begin to pass without announcing themselves, measured not by events but by accumulation, and she grows older within the same rooms, a mainstream historical reality for working women whose lives were defined by continuity rather than transformation, while historians still argue whether such steadiness was resilience or resignation disguised as virtue. The workshop changes ownership once, then again fashion shift. Buttons alter shape, yet the work remains, and with it her reputation for reliability, a trait praised publicly because it asks nothing back, a quiet compliment that feels both earned and faintly hollow. There is a quirky habit among seamstresses of keeping scraps from important garments, and she does this without quite admitting why, storing a piece of dark wool that once passed through his hands, practical enough to justify, personal enough to matter. She hears his name one final time from a travelling client, mentioned with mild admiration, and the neutrality of the tone surprises her, because distance has softened what once felt sharp, proving that time does not erase memory so much as redistribute its weight. Historians still argue whether emotional bonds survive without reinforcement, yet standing here with her, it is clear that survival does not require maintenance so much as acceptance, a quieter labour that rarely receives narrative attention. She never marries, not from tragic devotion, but because independence, once learned, resists disruption, and companionship that arrives too late often feels like intrusion rather than rescue. A truth rarely romanticised but deeply understood by those who wait long enough. He, she learns indirectly, rises in respect, becomes known for discipline and restraint, and a fringe belief among soldiers suggests that the strictest men are often those who once allowed themselves exactly one private softness. Sometimes she imagines what she would say if he appeared again, then lets the thought pass, because rehearsed reunions belong to a younger self who still believed explanations could rearrange outcomes. Historians still argue whether closure is necessary for emotional resolution, but her life suggests another answer. That resolution can emerge gradually through routine competence and the quiet pride of having endured without spectacle. When winter bells echo through the streets at dusk, she still pauses, not with ache but with recognition, because some moments do not ask to be relived, only acknowledged for having shaped the rhythm of everything that followed. History never accords their names together, which is perhaps the most precise ending Tsarist society could offer, because imperial records favour rank, service and outcome, not emotional intersections that leave no visible trace, and historians still argue whether such omissions reflect indifference or an intentional narrowing of what was deemed worth preserving. He completes his service with distinction, moving through postings as expected, his life unfolding along a sanctioned path that rewards discipline and silence, while a fringe belief among veterans holds that the heaviest burdens carried are often those that never appear in official commendations. She continues her work, older now, steadier, her hands still sure, her posture relaxed in a way youth never allows, and those who know her only as a seamstress would never suspect that her composure was shaped by something once almost spoken and then carefully set aside. They do not meet again, not because fate intervenes dramatically, but because structure succeeds, schedules align against chance, and the machinery of empire functions exactly as designed, preventing unresolved stories from re-entering the present. Sometimes she imagines him passing the workshop unknowingly, then smiles faintly at the thought, because imagination is now a place of safety rather than longing, a sign that memory has softened into something survivable. He occasionally recalls her without context, a quiet competence, a calm presence, and historians still argue whether memory stripped of detail loses meaning, though in practice such memories often endure longer, precisely because they demand nothing further. A quirky observation from later social writers suggests that lives constrained by duty often produce their deepest truths in omission, and this story, defined by what never happened, fits that pattern with uncomfortable precision. In the end, nothing collapses, no scandal erupts, no vows are broken publicly, and yet something undeniable has occurred, because restraint has not erased love, only redistributed it into endurance, habit, and a life shaped quietly but permanently by waiting. The city settles again into winter, snow returning to familiar corners, sound softening under its weight. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear how nothing is wrong and everything has already changed. Stories like this do not ask for resolution, they ask for recognition, a gentle acknowledgement that not all love seeks completion. She rests now in history as countless others do, unnamed, unremarked, yet present in the small continuities that carried her forward. He too is folded into records that speak of service and restraint, leaving out the interior costs that made those virtues possible. And that is all right. Not every truth needs documentation to remain true. If you're listening late, lights low, thoughts drifting, let this story remind you that some connections matter precisely because they were never tested by outcome. They refine us quietly, teach us how to endure without bitterness, and then step aside so life can continue. Breathe slowly, let the images loosen. Let the waiting, if it echoes anywhere in you, soften into understanding rather than regret. Some loves do not arrive to stay, but they arrive to shape the way we move through everything that follows. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.